it is my honor, my great pleasure, to introduce you all to two wonderful individuals to talk about the Carl Jung's influence on AA and a lot of Jungian perspectives on recovery and such. So we have David Schoen with us. David is a Jungian analyst, has extensive experience and a strong background as an alcoholism addiction counselor, senior analyst at the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, and co-founder and former coordinator of the New Orleans Jungian Training Seminar. David has a wonderful book called The War of the Gods in Addiction, and I'll put details, The War of the Gods of Addiction. I'll put details of that in the chat. That's how I found out about David, reading that wonderful book. And we have back, by popular demand, Jay Stinnett. Jay has been active in the Beverage Fellowship for 44 years. He started leading retreats on the Jung correspondence in 1995. That would be the Jung correspondence between Carl Jung and Bill Wilson. So Jay is the author of a forthcoming book on Bill Wilson's life outside of AA. In 2012, he published Loving Sober, a field guide to spiritual intimacy. He is also a member of the Oxford Group, now known as Initiatives of Change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jay to kick us off here.
I'm just delighted to be here with all of you, and especially with David. It's wonderful to see you, and do what I can to help expose people to this marvelous contribution that that I feel you've made to something that's very dear to my heart. I think what I'd like to do in the first part of this is to focus as much on your work as possible so that people might be stimulated to get it and inform their hearts and minds upon it. And then maybe after a half hour, 40 minutes, we can natter about a couple things that we might find of personal interest to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable within the group here. Great title. How great a title is that? The War of the Gods in Addiction. Good job, dude. That's fantastic. Where did that come to you from?
I had a client who had a dream about the cosmic war between God and the devil in the St. Louis Cathedral. And it struck me as that was like the war of the gods. And then as more and more I worked in this area and came across the letters and everything, and I saw the implications of what Jung was talking about, I was thinking, well, that really fits, and that there is an archetypal element, I believe, in addiction, and that the battlefield is not personal, it's archetypal. And so we have to have archetypal forces countering negative archetypal forces, which Jung talks about being, he refers to as very much misunderstood, but he said it's aptly called Satan. So, and it's not the, don't get caught up in the image. I'm a phenomenologist like Jung, and that what we're concerned about is not the label, it's what is the actual phenomena and what kind of images are being used to try to describe that phenomena. So that's where I'm coming from with the initial idea of the War of the Gods. Yeah.
That's beautiful. In your conclusion, you talk about a hope that you have that you would be considered a friend of AA's. And I have to tell you that having meditated upon a lot of this information over the years, not from a Jungian standpoint, but coming to it strictly from an AA historical backdrop, that I find this work to be incredibly engaging, and I hope that the gang here will see that. Now you're in we have a lot of different people that are from different fellowships, and so could you talk a little bit about your own personal, how did a nice guy like you get in a place like this with people like us?
Well, I'm a clinical social worker. I have 3 brothers and a sister who pretty much were saved by 12-step stuff. And I realized at some point that without the 12-step programs, they would probably be dead. And it got me curious about what were, and then I had time working as an alcohol addiction counselor and got up close to that. My mother-in-law is a recovering alcoholic. So it's been all around me. And I began to realize that, most, sadly, mental health people think they know about addiction, but they don't. And they have just as many stereotypes and misunderstandings as the folks on the street. And so I thought in writing my book that I would try to address in a way that could be understood, where you wouldn't have to be a true believer in 12-step stuff to understand what the dynamics were about addiction and why AA and the 12 steps has been such an effective counter, the only really effective counter as far as I'm concerned, to addiction. We have aids that help with that, but nothing has been as successful as the 12-step programs, What was your question again, Jay?
No, that was perfect. That was perfect.
Oh, okay, all right, yeah.
So, springing off your response, because Jung had experience of spirit, but most of his colleagues totally dismissed him because of that. Isn't it interesting that here you are I'd like to say that you've been involved in the industrial side of recovery, and it's very much the same thing so could you speak a little bit about maybe Jung's struggle to be recognized, or maybe not struggle to be recognized, but the pushback that he received from looking at a holistic view of the human being as opposed to just a rationalist?
Yeah, Jung, and it's part of what drew me to Jung from the beginning, was that I had, examined many other therapeutic systems. And when I hit Jungian psychology, I realized immediately that this was deeper and wider than I would ever get to the end of, whereas other systems, I would go into it and learn it and say, okay, I got it. I understand that. I understand how that works, et cetera. Systems and family stuff and whatever. And so Jung had an appreciation for the big view of the psyche as having more than, like Freud, that's just our sort of garbage can of unconscious stuff that repress things. And Jung saw inherent wisdom and healing capacities in the psyche that he talks about as being spiritual, not in terms of belonging to a religion, but in terms, again, of the phenomena of the spirit and that whole process. But he was very much misunderstood by people who believed that he, was a prophet or trying to sell religion, or what he was exploring was not appropriate for psychology, and his view was anything that affects human beings is appropriate to look at psychologically. And so everywhere he looked, he saw the whole issue of soul and spirituality and the meaning of life permeating everything. So it was appropriate for him to look at that, but he got a lot of grief for that. And a lot of people misunderstood and even dismissed him because of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that the material reductionists have hijacked psyche and what psychology really meant in the beginning, and have made it something that is totally devoid of spirit. It's remarkable.
Yeah, actually, I mean, you point out something great, Jay, that I always like to point out to people, that psychotherapy, that psycho is soul, therapy is soul healing. So inherently, psychotherapy is soul healing, and so you can't take the spiritual aspect out of that. That's ridiculous, you know. But there are a lot of therapists who are not comfortable with that and feel like that stuff is just your personal belief and it has nothing to do with what's going on in the therapeutic process, you know, which is very short-sighted, very short-sighted. So with my book, I was trying to introduce to those kinds of reductionistic, concrete people, sort of step by step, why the principles in AA were effective. It wasn't just about a belief system, that there were clear dynamics involved in that could be explained aside from the AA terminology and program. And of course, the best language to describe that I found was Jungian psychology. So that's why that's where I went, because it sort of fit perfectly in the translation, so that therapists in general would be able to look at this in a sort of fair-minded way, you know, that it wasn't just AA wasn't just brainwashing or a cult or some fanatical thing that somebody invented, you know. Yeah.
And I want to mention to everybody how clear and I don't want to say concise, but it is a concise book, and you deal with a lot of very large topics, but the language is very engaging. So please, folks, don't think that you're going to get into some psychological tome. David's book is very, very clear.
And I did try, Jay, to write the book so that anyone who was, you know, fairly intelligent could understand and read it, that there's not a bunch of inherent esoteric language and things that, you know, you might have to stretch a little bit in some places, but I think I tried to explain it in a way that almost anyone could understand what I was getting at. Yeah, that was my intention, you know.
Yeah, well, I think you did an excellent job. You know,
thank you, appreciate that. Yeah.
Now it's fun that in this first folks, in the letter that Jung wrote to Bill Wilson, he talks about biblical language as medieval language, which just the first time I read it, it made my heart sing, because a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about going forward, we're going to be using, and David already mentioned, you know, Satan and evil and a couple other things. This is medieval language. It's not, we're not talking theological constructs here, but we are talking about mental and emotional way, or things that have been, terms that have been used to articulate human beings' spiritual and mental evolution back to medieval times. In this book, this wonderful book, The War of the Gods in Addiction, you talk a lot, you describe a number of different theological systems, and then you get into you introduce a lot of current mythology, like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and the Wizard of Oz and all that. Could you speak a little bit about the evolution of these great ways of conveying the archetypes or the shadow self in a way that I found very engaging in your book?
Well, yeah. One of the things that Jung believes about archetypes is that they're potentially always possible to be constellated for human beings and that they're everywhere for all time. He doesn't say how many there are or not. It's like that's an open question, but they are universal, and they are the great influencers of the individual human beings with the energy. And for example, when a woman becomes pregnant, whether she knows anything about Jungian psychology or archetypes, she enters into the archetype of the mother, and that constellates and triggers all kinds of things physiologically along with the pregnancy, as well as psychologically. Every young man boy who is trying to transition to become a man enters into the territory of the hero archetype and having to prove himself. Now that's been imaged, in many, many different ways and traditions. Some of the things that a lot of people would know would be like the Knights of the Round Table in the old days, and then Top Gun in more modern times, in terms of these initiation rituals that help move people into boys into a maturity as a man. So the archetypes basically look different with different images in different times and places. But again, the phenomenon, the essence of that is the same in terms of what's going on. So we need to look beyond the label and the image to see, well, what is that referring to? And so I looked at what I considered to be the archetypal implications in addiction that were at play, in addition to the individual dynamics and ego, and in Jungian psychology, we call the personal shadow. And what I saw, and I got really directly from the Bill W. Carl Jung letters, is this concept that I talk about. Jung doesn't actually refer to it in his letter as archetypal shadow, archetypal evil, but in other places he mentions things, and other analysts make references to that, which is a shadow element that is not personal. It's transpersonal, that I believe comes into play in an addiction in a way that an archetypal shadow, as opposed to personal shadow, is not integratable, digestible, educable, transformable. I mean, it is like, it cannot be assimilated, which is very rare in terms of, especially for Jungian folks, to talk about something that can't somehow be integrated into the psyche and worked with. But this is something in a special category. And I got really attacked about this from some people who really didn't know enough, who accused me of inventing this concept. So I went to great pains to show that I didn't invent this concept, And so in many different traditions and situations, in myths and fairy tales, and in modern times in movies, we see the archetypes played out on the screen. So you have the battle of the archetypes of good and evil in Star Wars, in Lord of the Rings, in Harry Potter. And so there are many places where there are characters and figures who are representing aspects, Darth Vader and Sauron in Lord of the Rings, and I forget who it is, Lord Voldemort in Harry Potter, and who actually sort of embody, they're the main controlling of the kingdom of evil and archetypal shadow. Actually, it was my brother was helpful with this, because I had all these archaic references to old myths and stuff, and he talked to me and he said, well, David, this is really good, but nobody knows anything about Odin and whatever. So, okay. And he said, do you have some modern stuff that people could relate to? And then I was, oh yeah. So then that's when I added these things that I think people can relate to a lot better than Loki and all these other things, which I'm not saying people don't know, but that's not as common as Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So they image some of these aspects so that you can get the idea of that. Now, when I talk about addiction, and I've arrived at a definition of addiction, that it is a behavior that ultimately has to take over complete control, be the number one priority in the psyche, the prime agenda. Everything else comes secondary to that. But here's the proviso. But it also has to have the ability to kill you, which is what I see the archetypal shadow, archetypal evil aspect of an addiction is about. So I don't believe that eating too much chocolate is an addiction. I don't believe that, people muddy up the picture when they talk about positive addictions and stuff. And I think we need to be able to distinguish between a real addiction and what's abuse and experimentation, and somebody might have a bad habit, but it's not going to kill them. People who really deal with real addictions and live with real addictions know that this will kill you. I don't have to convince them. It's the other people who have trouble believing that. So long answer to your question, Jay.
No, that's all I'm trying to do is tee up, my friend. I want them to hear the way that I got it from that your definition of addiction is that if there isn't the death card involved, that it's something else. But I also tell you that there are many people on here that are in food programs, and I know from my own association with people that it's as deadly as many things.
Yeah, and by the way, on that, Jay, people have asked me, well, exactly what is and isn't, and my answer is whatever fits the definition that I gave you could be an addiction. So work could be an addiction, food can be an addiction, gambling, drugs, alcohol. I mean, if it becomes something that takes over control of the person and has the ability to kill you, then that qualifies. Smoking can be an addiction.
Yeah.
And then it can be just a really bad habit,
Yeah.
So it all depends on the individual and what's happening with that. Yeah. So.
Now it seems to me, just taking that, and that's perfect. That again, it's the death card with any individual that may be different, or what it is that they're engaged with, the way that the demon has presented itself. That they it'll kill them, and so this brings me to a point just from your experience in the industry. It used to be that coming into Alcoholics Anonymous was you diagnosed yourself In other words, you had to figure out that you had a problem. It was back when the fellowships were basically anonymous. And now it's like everybody's referred to the fellowship. So therefore, it's something that somebody's told them as opposed to their own desperation. That's the motivational factor in recovery. In your experience and within this Jungian framework, is there any way that we can approach people that have been referred to us in a way that can help them accept this the fatality or the ultimate powerlessness that they're experiencing?
But it's a good question, and I don't believe what I've said is that if everybody in the world decides you're an alcoholic or you're addicted, but you don't believe it, then it doesn't make any difference. The individual has to be able to see it. And of course, a lot of folks resist that tremendously and trying to prove, by giving up alcohol for Lent or this or that they're not addicted, that they can control it. And so one of the things that I do with someone who comes in, who's asking the question, am I in trouble, or am I abusing, or am I an alcoholic? I mean, I never decide for the person. And I have an experiment that I usually do with them, which is about the control. I say, well, okay, if you believe you can control it or take it or leave it, then let's try that. Let's go 6 weeks and see if you can go not having a drink or smoking your grass or doing whatever it is. And then, which then puts evidence, if you can, that, well, maybe you're not addicted. Maybe you're just abusing that. But then I get to, of course, and what I tell them is if they commit to that and they can't do it, then I say, well, that's evidence that goes on the side that maybe you can't control this, okay? Or you're not taking this seriously. But then the next step is we introduce the potentially addictive behavior and see whether, okay, so say if you think you've been having trouble with alcohol, let's try, you're going to have two drinks, you're going to drink 2 times a week and no more than 2 drinks. Now, can you do that or not? Well, they're going to come in and either tell me that, yeah, they did it and they did fine, or, once they started drinking, they had more and they drank more often. And, so then I say, well, that's evidence on the side of that you can't control it, which is then evidence on the side of you probably are addicted. But you have to decide that. You have to see that. And sometimes they have to go out and experiment and try again and fail, and then come to the conclusion that they really are helpless and powerless over it, like the 12 steps talk about. And then they are willing to surrender to that they need more than their ego trying to wrestle and control it. They're going to need some archetypal help with AA talks about the higher power, and that's the archetypal element in the first 3 steps that cancels out the horrific death dealing archetype of shadow. I call it archetypal shadow / evil, because some people like to use one term or the other and they're the same thing. But that's what neutralizes it. It doesn't kill it. It doesn't destroy it, but it allows the person to live their life and to actually grow and transform and heal. But the potential is always there, like AA talks about, of the addiction being reactivated if a person decides they're going to try going down that path again with exposure to the addictive substance or behavior, you know?
So as a historian, my goal is to try and help people have their own relationship with the person or the individual. So in other words, Bill Wilson or with Carl Jung and the like. So I think what it might be fun is let me set up Wilson's first letter and let's have a quick discussion, you and I, kind of walking through Jung's response. Now, everybody, I have to tell you these two letters are in the public domain, and you can, in fact, I bet you Patrick can probably even drop a link in the chat where you can get this. It's also in Language of the Heart, and it's also available in the AA Grapevine historical documents. So that's, but I believe personally that 6-7 paragraphs that Jung wrote is one of the most beautiful descriptions of recovery and the impediments to it. So does that sound like something that'd be fun?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, and I've got my book here, so I can just turn right to that and follow with whatever.
So just to contextualize it for everyone, Bill Wilson had wanted to write Jung a letter of thanks, and Carl Jung, the last 5 years of his life, from about 1957 on, was having a lot of health problems, and Bill was always talking about writing the letter and never writing the letter. I don't know if anybody here who would have something like that happen. And then a friend of his in his circle, Rhoda, she was friends with Analia Jaffe, and because Wilson was one of these people that got hundreds of letters a week, and he's going, why should I send this to how can I send this to Dr. Jung and just be another letter on the thing? And Rhoda said, send it care of his personal secretary. That way he'll get it. And so Bill follows that, and he wrote this letter in July of, or I mean, I'm sorry, in
January
of 1961.
Yeah.
And in it, he thanks Dr. Jung for all this stuff, and he describes the evolution of Alcoholics Anonymous as a movement, and he says there something that's hijacked by many Jungians, that he says that we could take the start of our movement from what happened in your office when you were speaking with Roland. He doesn't say Roland, but with a patient. But that where AA started was the humility of your diagnosis that you could not help this person, that he was beyond human aid. And then he goes on to thank him a bit more. So, and then just days later, Jung fires him back a letter because it got to Analia. She said, take a look.
In less than a week, Jay. It was less than a week.
Yeah.
And this is Jung has about 5 months to live.
Right.
So, you talk about the last will and testament of a person. This was close to it in terms of Jung wanted to get this out. Yes. Right. Yeah.
So please, why don't, well, here, I tell you what, why don't I read a paragraph and then you comment on it? And
okay, that sounds good. Yeah.
Then we'll go from there. Dear Mr. Wilson, your letter has been very welcome indeed. I had no news from Roland H. anymore and often wondered what had been his fate. Our conversation, which he has adequately reported to you, had an aspect of which he did not know. The reason that I could not tell him everything was that in those days I had to be exceedingly careful of what I said. I had found out that I was misunderstood in every possible way. Thus, I was very careful when I talked to Roland H. But what I really thought was the result of many experiences with men of his kind, his craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God.
Yeah. What Jung believes is that the thirst for wholeness and spirituality and union with God is what underlies the attempt. It's a to get that, and it's almost like in Judeo-Christian terms, it's almost like you're worshiping a false idol, not the true idol. It's a false self, not the true self. And so, but it's a start in terms of looking and searching. And many alcoholics and people in recovery never would have gotten to their spirituality and the transformation if it wasn't for their addiction, which was humiliating and difficult, but it eventually got them to places that they probably never would have gone without it, you know. And what I call people, I say, it's kind of like you know, you can choose to live a superficial life, and so what, you know, maybe it's not so meaningful. But if you're an addicted person and you don't get this, it means you're going to die. Okay. So the stakes are way higher in regards to getting this idea of the need for higher power, spirituality, union with God, connection, you know? Yeah. So, and Jung could clearly see that. And yeah. Okay.
If the unitive experience is having one's mind, one's spirit, and one's body in the same place at the same time, many alcoholics, when they have that first drink or the third one finally stays down, that's exactly what maybe happens for the first time in their existence, that they have a unitive experience.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, the first drink, forget who logs it, and I referred to it in the book of Bill W., was this unbelievable, numinous experience. I mean, when you read it, you think, well, why wouldn't you want that? You know, I mean, it was like, wow, you know, everything, people were talking to him, and you know, and he was so comfortable, more comfortable than he had ever been, and you know, and it's like, wow, yeah, why wouldn't you want that? You know,
right? Well, a Bronx cocktail will do that to almost anybody. So here Jung goes on. He goes, how could one formulate such an insight about the union of God, the search for our being with wholeness, in a language that is not misunderstood in our days? The only right and legitimate way to such an experience is that it happens to you in reality, and it can only happen to you when you walk on a path which leads you to a higher understanding. You might be led to that goal by an act of grace, or through a personal and honest contact with friends, or through a higher education of the mind. I love this, beyond mere rationalism.
And what Jung articulated that's packed in that one paragraph is he was describing the three main principles of AA in terms of by an act of grace, which is higher power that AA talks about, and then personal and honest contact. That's the fellowship. That's you can't do this alone. You have to do it in community. The archetypal shadow, archetypal evil aspect, it loves to just catch a straggler out on their own, away from the herd. You know, So it's like, if you just think you can do this by reading a book and everybody else can just go away, you're missing it. And then the last thing, the higher education of the mind, is really about, the 12 steps and working the steps and understanding what that's all about. So Jung articulated the three main ingredients in AA when he described that. He didn't realize he was doing that, but that's what he was doing. Yeah. So I thought it was just such perfect mirroring of what AA had discovered through its own process, that somehow Jung could see that that's what it was about,
I see from your letter that Roland has chosen the second way, which was, under the circumstances, obviously the best. Then Jung says, I am strongly convinced that the evil principle prevailing in this world leads the unrecognized spiritual need into perdition, if it is not counteracted either by a real religious insight or by the protective wall of human community. An ordinary man, not protected by an action from above and isolated in society, cannot resist the power of evil, which is very aptly called the devil, but the use of such words arouses so many mistakes that one can only keep aloof from them as much as possible.
Right. And so Jung, I say that he sort of, he doesn't say much in his collected works or whatever about addiction or alcoholism and stuff, but this is where he says the most about it. And it's almost like he knows he's leaving, and he sort of rolls out this bomb and says, okay, you guys deal with this, you can't attack me now, I'm going to be gone. So, but here's what I really think. And I mean, I was so blown away when I read that particular paragraph, that where he doesn't say, if you don't have religious insight or the human community protecting you, that you might have trouble or you would have difficulty with, that it's, but if you're not protected by that, you cannot resist evil. It's an absolute statement, and it's so powerful if you really, and Jung uses words very precisely. And so he didn't use those words by accident. And then he goes on, and he knew it would be a shocker when he said that it was aptly called the devil, but there were so many uses of that would be misunderstood. People would, and there still are today. There are people who believe that is just archaic folk belief that isn't really real in any way, and that we're way beyond that. We're way beyond believing in the devil. Well, maybe we are beyond somebody's version of the guy with the pitchfork and the horns and stuff, but what the devil was imaging in terms of the phenomena that human beings were dealing with still exist, and that's what Jung was talking about. Not that you had to believe in some myth version of the devil, but that he represents that phenomenon that is very real in terms of evil. Yeah. And that really right there was the launching pad for my whole writing the book,
Yeah.
So I said, well, okay, we're going to unpackage that,
This is where we're very simpatico. I like to look at the meetings as like the ramparts, and we're pulling people over into this this realm of safety. Then we'll saving their lives, but first we've got to get them into the boat. And I love that image. And then I don't know about devils, but I do know about vampires. And if you're sitting across, as you do professionally all the time, with people that are sitting there that have not been, that were absolutely convinced that they had it, and they're loaded again, and sitting across from that vampire, if you're a person in recovery, you have the awareness of grace incarnate in your life and existence. And without that,
right, you're toast. I know, and I know the story's gone around because other people have told me they've heard it. But I had a client who was in recovery, and he was in a treatment program, and he and the guys had been there about a week, and they're all sort of saying they got it, they got it figured out, they know what's going on, but and they had an old grizzled black counselor who said, guys, while you're sitting here patting yourself on the back about how great this is, your addiction's out in the parking lot doing push-ups waiting for you. And boy, that got their attention. It's like, what? Yeah, it is out to get you. Yeah, so absolutely.
So to finish this up, there are reasons why, these are the reasons why I could not give a full and sufficient explanation to Roland, but I'm risking it with you because I include from your very decent and honest letter that you've acquired a point of view above the misleading platitudes one usually hears about alcoholism. You see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as the most depraving poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum. Thanking you again for your very kind letter I would make.
And that also fit right into, the most powerful spirit of healing and light, religious experience, the highest, against the sort of worst, and again, in the archetypal realm. So again, the war of the gods came right into play with that concept. And that it's sort of interesting because what Jung is suggesting is that there's sort of a homeopathic remedy here in the archetypal realm, that it's different kinds of spirit that can cancel out different things, and that if we don't get that and we think that our puny ego can somehow handle this, we're missing it. We're missing the boat. And so the first three steps in AA really came out of Jung's experience with Roland, and then got passed down to Roland, got into the Oxford movement, and then he helped EBT get sober, and then EBT helped Bill W. And then the story got passed down of what Jung had told Roland about his powerlessness, that he couldn't help him anymore, and that there was something that was out there, but it was of spiritual nature, and he needed to turn himself over to that. And that's when he found the Oxford movement, which helped him initially get sober. Now, I understand ultimately he couldn't keep it, but still he did for a long time and did good stuff.
I think it's very haughty of us that are in the 12-step fellowship to evaluate people that got the gifts in the Oxford group under AA's terminology and methodology. And that's not what they were shooting for. Anyway, but so we've covered this. I know we'll have a lot of questions coming.
Yeah, sure. That was great. Yeah, we really got to the main things that I wanted to somehow get over to. Yeah. And
then there's one other question. I was wondering if you're familiar with our friend Ian McCabe's work regarding the Countess Marguerite van Luttenkahl and bringing the book Alcoholics Anonymous to Dr. Jung in 1945.
No, no.
Well, this is a marvelous thing. Marguerite van Luttenkahl was in therapy with Frances Whelan up in Nantucket, famous Jungian at the time, and she'd come over. She'd been a student with Jung in
Zurich.
Zurich.
Yeah.
Anyway, the war ends and she's going back, and Bill gives her a copy of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. She comes to see, and she gave Bill a copy of Modern Man in Search of a Soul. So Bill sends this through her to Jung. Jung, as you know, was always very diffident about any groups at all.
Mhm.
Read the book, and he had her come back the next day, and he gave her instructions on how this, and I don't know what the instructions are, this is just from her correspondence with Wilson, about how this could be applied in group work with neurotics. So Jung had a change of mind after he heard about the way that spirit was being kept alive and passed on within Alcoholics Anonymous back in 45. Now, I don't think he'd remember that in 61, but still he did have some contact with the message just after the Second World War.
Yeah, and he had to have, by 61, he had to have been exposed to the awareness that some of the AA effectiveness was happening, places. I mean, even if it wasn't as widespread, that it was helping alcoholics and all. And so, Bill W.'s letter to him and then Jung's back was sort of replaying the history of what happened. And I just thought it was sort of a perfect piece by piece from both of them of that, Now, so no, I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Yeah.
In my work, one of the things that I'm using is the second letter that Wilson wrote to Jung after he received the letter back from the doctor. And I used to say that he died, he didn't have a chance to read it, but Bill and Analia Jaffe had correspondence where she said he'd read the letter, that he was interested, that he was looking forward to responding to her, but his doctors wouldn't let him